Papi, ¿cómo te llamas tú?
Jonier.
Y amor, ¿cómo te llamas tú?
Miguel.
Compa, Miguel.
Объясните мне, пожалуйста, одну вещь. Да? Если вы, как утверждаете, получили 80% голосов на выборах в прошлом году, то почему тогда вышли толпы народа в Минске, да не только в Минске, по всей стране, да, не для того, чтобы вас поздравить, да, с сокрушительной победой, а для того, чтобы обвинить вас в том, что вы украли их голоса? Вот несостыковка какая-то, нет, получается?
Это у вас несостыковка в голове, Стив. У вас и у ваших патронов. Отвечаю на ваш вопрос. Вы назвали цифру 80%. Это не я цифру назвал. Это назвала законная Центральная избирательная комиссия.
Ну, вы согласны с цифрой?
Послушайте меня. ЦИК назвал эту цифру 80%. Это факт, законный факт. Вы говорите, толпы вышли и прочее. Стив, 25 лет толпами ходят по Минску после выборов ваши сторонники в Беларуси. Это было постоянно.
Но, Александр Георгиевич,
только в этом году, вы слушать не умеете, только в этом году это было более подготовлено с вашей стороны вами, фондами немецкими, английскими, американскими фондами, деньги вбросили, людей здесь на фоне пандемии подготовили, и этот процесс занял чуть больше.
Это не ответ на мой вопрос.
Больший послушай меня, чуть больший промежуток.
Я находился
Поэтому
здесь.
80 тысяч, если не будешь слушать, разговор закончится, если ты этого хочешь. Поэтому 80% это законный, неопровержимый факт. Других цифр у вас нет.
И все-таки 80%, да, вот должны быть, по идее, какие-то проявления, я не знаю, всенародной любви к победителю, к лидеру, да, а вместо этого люди выходили в большом количестве и кричали: «Лукашенко, уходи!» И вы летали на вертолете в бронике с автоматом, как будто вы боялись собственного народа. Несостыковка.
Вы говорите любви. Это в Америке вы умеете, в Великобритании изображать любовь. А что было после выборов? Сколько у нас людей приходило на митинги и до сих пор ездят с государственными флагами. И люди все больше и больше прозревают. И сегодня их уже не 80%. Сегодня их 87, а может и 90%.
Вы верите, что я находился?
Почему нет? Мы же демократическая страна, кто хотел, тот и
Ну, когда я вам говорю, что мы видели.
Что вы видели?
Мы видели большие толпы народа.
Большие, согласен.
Видели, как правоохранительные органы забирали людей. Мирные протестующие, мирные демонстранты. Мы видели, как били этих людей. И мы видели, как выходили из Окрестина молодые парни, да, с побоями. Это мы видели, это не взято с интернета, да? Это мы видели. Кадры, вот смотрите.
Не надо, я это признаю.
Вы признаете?
И в Окрестина получали там, и избитые в милицию. Вы только бойцов из Окрестина не показывали, что они были избиты. А что бы было, если бы у вас или в Америке, тем более, бросились на милиционера, начали ему ломать ноги? Он бы получил пулю в лоб сразу, но мы ни в кого не стреляли пулю в лоб.
С июля месяца, да, ликвидировано 270 НКО в Беларуси.
Отвечаю на твой вопрос, не трудись. Выражем всех мерзавцев, которых вы финансировали. Ах, вы озаботились, что мы уничтожили ваши структурки, НКО, НПО и прочее, которые вы финансировали. Мы людей, которые работали на Беларусь, которые помогали людям, пальцем не тронули, а те, которые пользовались вашей помощью, получая от вас финансирование, и громили здесь ваших, которых вы видели здесь в Минске, если мы кого-то не ликвидировали, то мы их ликвидируем в ближайшее время.
То есть офис по правам людей с инвалидностью ликвидирован, да?
Слушайте.
Центр любителей животных. Это разве оружие Запада?
А то, что вы называете животных там, звучит на картинку. А вы посмотрите, чем они занимались. Вот для меня, кстати, это новость, но я уверен, что вот это была шильда, что они защищали животных, а деньги они получали на свое существование и на революции здесь, не на революции, на мятежи. Поэтому не прикрывайтесь этими словами. Животных вы тут поддерживали.
270 НКО работает против Беларуси, финансируемый Западом, да?
Я не знаю, сколько точно финансировали вы НКО, но если они ликвидированы, значит, было за что.
Еще одна цифра, да? 873 политических заключенных.
У нас нет политической статистики. У нас нет политической статьи, по которым мы осудили или судим людей. У нас их нет.
873 человека.
Это люди, нарушившие белорусское законодательство.
То есть сколько политзаключенных в Беларуси?
У нас нет политзаключенных. Ты что, не слышишь, что я говорю?
Ни одного.
Ни одного, потому что нет такой статьи.
А Мария Колесникова не политзаключенная?
Это ваш агент. Это ваш агент.
Почему она сидит?
И вы, потому что она нарушила закон.
Ну, смелый человек, согласитесь, да? То есть возглавила протесты, не покинула страну.
Мария Колесникова бежала из страны, ее задержали на границе.
Она паспорт разобрала?
Она съела паспорт, это ее дело.
Она не хотела покинуть страну?
Слушайте, я не знаю, что она хотела. И знать не хочу. Она бежала вместе со своими соратниками.
А то, что она сидит, это не месть с вашей стороны?
Абсолютно нет. Запомните, я не тот человек, который может мстить. Запомните это и усвойте, если вы хотите, как человек меня понять. Я против женщин, я часто говорю, не воюю.
All right. I'm going to jump right into it, Tom. I want to know, there's a couple of questions that I've been pondering for quite some time. And tonight we're going to be talking mainly on geopolitics. This is a topic I don't get to discuss that often on my channel. Most of the people I interview don't really know all that much about what's going on outside of the Anglosphere. I mean, we obviously hear about what's happening in Australia and New Zealand and Europe regarding the lockdowns, the vaccine passports, et cetera, but there's more to this. I mean, the media tends to make us focus on specific current events, and there's reasons for that, because they don't really want you to know what's really happening elsewhere in the world. You'll get little snippets here and there, maybe a quick little video you might see online in Fox or NBC, and there's occasional articles talking about international news, but most Americans don't really know all that much about the outside world. I always joke about how, the coronavirus came from a wet market, Wuhan. Ooh, like it's some mystery that we developed this mythology around other parts of the world. There was that strain, I don't know whether it's the Omicron one or the Delta, but it's from Botswana. Ooh, yeah. Meanwhile, Botswana is just a flat plain that's sparsely populated. You don't really hear all that much out of Botswana, but you hear the word Botswana, the name Botswana, again, you start to have these Hollywood cartoon images in your head of people with a lip disc and stuff like that. So when COVID hit, there's obviously tensions between the Anglosphere and China, along with Russia. Now, when COVID hit, we got those videos out of China. People just dropping dead, right? People, walking to a market and then just falling flat on their face, and people running over to help them. You saw some of the clips on TikTok and on Twitter of the government barricading people inside their condominiums and in their homes. We also saw a serious lockdown that came out of Wuhan, people stuck in their high rises. I felt for it. I go, this is pretty serious, man. And you had the whole, what was it? The Coronavirus Central. You had that series going on. It was super popular. So
30,000 listeners a day.
Yeah, it's amazing. So here we are, China's a bad guy, yet we lock down also. So China and the West, the whole world is on board for this mass wealth redistribution, destroying the energy sector, pumping the stock market up, inflation. But at the same time, we're supposed to hate China. Do you think that this was a weapon from China to throw the Anglosphere and the European Union off kilter and try to destroy them economically? Or do you think China is working in tandem with the powers that be controlling the Western Hemisphere and Europe for that matter?
All right. Well, let me first say thank you for having me on the show. Just as a quick thing, and Merry Christmas to everyone. May the Lord's blessing be upon you. I'm going to answer 3 different questions here, and the last one will be the one you just asked, but there's a reason why I'm doing this in this order, and let's see if I can keep my brain organized enough on a late evening. All right, so the first thing we have to consider is we're talking about geopolitics tonight, and there are 2 contradictory facts we have to deal with. We have to deal with the fact that there are global institutions primarily being driven by the banking and technology classes working towards global homogenization rather, under this premise of, we call it the deep state, the new world order, whatever it is, woke ideologies, massive humanism, this idea that we're trying to converge towards a singular solution. Some of them are ideologues, some of them are bureaucrats, some of them are technologists, but they tend to represent a lot of private sector forces, and they tend to be string pullers that act upon governments. At the other hand, you also have the geopolitical competition that is between great powers. And what we have seen is the so-called American hegemony, the end of history moment, as Fukuyama said, is giving away something more like what Samuel Huntington used to talk about, that there was competing civilizations fighting against each other. We're seeing the emergence of a stronger Russian bloc in association with the Asian economy. And what we're really seeing in a lot of ways on a global level is a replay of what happened before World War I, where there was the concert of powers in Europe that was on one direction, but there was also the Thucydides trap that was coming into play. And this is like one of the basic stories of Western history. It's that a fading power, in this case, the United States of America, is going to do everything it can to try to kneecap a rising power, in this case, the People's Republic of China, and the competition between them begins to shape the global effort. And so you see the rising power trying to go ahead and build new institutionality or reappropriate existing institutions. And you'll see the fading power try to leverage alliances and usually use conflict. And to put it in a concrete thing, the British Empire basically stopped the German Empire from rising. But as those of you who follow history a little bit will know, neither Britain nor Germany is nearly as prominent as they were before 1914, or for that matter, for 1945. So these conflicts often end up being very destructive to both powers, like they were to Athens and Sparta. Athens was a mercantile power, Sparta was a land power, and even though Athens had great wealth, their cultural decay that happened basically led to the Spartans being able to conquer them. And it wasn't too long after that the Corinthians came in, and then eventually Alexander, who built an empire. This is the nature of how history works. And in geopolitics, we have to be able to consider both these contradictory trends, because it makes it very difficult where countries have certain interests, but yet a few people in this age of high technology, understanding leverage and triggers, much like financiers do, can change the agenda. Having laid all that out there, you asked the question about COVID, about China and origins. And one thing that has gone commented upon by a number of people is that when COVID broke, we noticed 3 distinctive terrible outbreaks. The first was in Wuhan in China, which began actually in December, really taking on steam December 2019, but really picked up in January. The second was in Milan, Italy. And it was presented as plausible because at the time, Milan had a very large textiles trade that had a lot of, migrant labor that came from China. And because they had the fashion markets connected to that, the thought was that's how they got into Milan. And if you'll remember, before all the woke people were wearing masks, they said it was racist if you didn't hug Chinese people, no matter how much they were coughing on you. So that happened in February and March of 2020. And then you see New York's area get hit very heavily with it. But what's interesting is when you look at the death rates of who died and how severe it was, certain places, specifically those three, got it way worse than anywhere else, almost as if there was an external trigger factor. Now, I don't know any genetic reason why it should be that Chinese people in Wuhan, Italians in Milan, and the Americans in New York should get sicker and have death at a much higher rate than anywhere else. And a lot of people made the conclusion after looking at it, there was probably some external environmental factor that was used to push this forward. I know a lot of New Yorkers are saying Cuomo putting people in the nursing homes played a role, or you could say, the Italians, the way they had their hospitals set up.
Well,
At the time,
there was a lot of people discussing in correlation that Chinese people, the Han ethnic group and the Italian ethnic group were those that were affected. In fact, the only other person I know that died from coronavirus happened to be an Italian American. So, and yes, you are correct. I recall it was beginning of December, and I was in Queens, New York, and my coworkers started getting sick right before Christmas. So, and a lot of them, when the virus did hit, broke news, was all over, lockdowns happened, et cetera, et cetera. My coworkers came up to me saying, we had COVID before anyone else. We just didn't know we didn't know we had it. And I remember they were really, really sick, but obviously we don't necessarily experience that strain of COVID anymore. The deaths peaked in I guess.
We have to say one thing that's really important. The same year that COVID happened really badly, the flu percentage in America went down by 98%. I think there's something there that people ask questions about. Where did the flu go? And the facile explanation they gave was saying that, well, everyone was wearing masks and everyone was keeping apart, so the flu didn't happen, which is an interesting and lovely theory, but it goes against the whole of human history in terms of how the flu spreads and propagates, especially considering kids were going to school. So there's a reasonable question, especially since we know the PCR testing doesn't really tell you anything, what they were really testing for and what was being put out there. So we say all this because you asked the question about who was responsible for COVID coming out. And the best answer I can offer based on the research is that the original funding came through the United States. It came through the National Institutes of Health. It came through people like Fauci and whoever actually funded that. There were people like, what's his name, Strazak. And there were people who do this a lot more detail than I do.
That Harvard professor's going to jail now.
Which is an interesting story, and I'll hit that in a second because that requires a little more depth to this. But what happened was the background on what's his name, Fauci, he was heavily involved with AIDS back in the day. And a lot of the problems we're seeing in terms of people with long-term responses, especially to the injections, has been where we now are seeing that antibody-dependent enhancement is happening because the immune system is miscalibrated. And yet, every time we have these weird things, we have AIDS, we have SARS, we have MERS, Middle East Respiratory Syndrome. All of these things, there's these weird trails going back to biological warfare and going back to people like Ralph Baric in the United States. So I do think that actually the original research was done by the Americans. Now, whether or not that was stolen by the Chinese, perhaps through Charles Lieber, and I forget the name of the guy in Canada, Jeff something, and then it was used, whether it was dropped by the Chinese to try to break the world economy, whether it was dropped by the Americans to break the Chinese economy, or maybe a third party, the Russians did it. Here's what is clear, that this was largely funded by the United States in conjunction with the World Health Organization. The Gates Foundation was heavily involved with this and the rollout and the precursors to this, and that the release in Wuhan probably happened to coincide with the World Military Games. I forget if it was early November or late October in 2019. Why this should be the timing is a fair question. And if the actors involved were acting on behalf of a given government, or perhaps as a part of a cabal that exists above a government that was responsible to other people. I mean, I think it's an interesting and sort of small observation that Fauci makes more money than anyone else in the federal government. And that we're not even looking at the patents he owns and that the CDC is allowed to gather, which is absolutely insane. And actually, one of the things that we didn't look, and I guess the dissonance sphere largely filled with this, is we didn't have a good understanding of how corrupt the disease industry was in big pharma. I mean, there were people looking at it, and we had looked at power politics, and we had looked at propaganda and the media control and technology in Silicon Valley, but we really didn't have a good enough understanding, I think, of just how corrupt big pharma is and how far biotech had advanced with the idea of direct control of people. When you look at like big companies like Moderna and what they've been looking at, or just if you do a general research of CRISPR technology. Now, regardless of who's responsible, it's very clear that every country, once this was released, started gaming it to their benefit. China withheld information and acted in a way where they wanted to work to their own strategic benefit. But then again, America shut its borders and did the same thing. What I suspect was this is part of a larger global reset to have a crisis come forward, because if you have a big enough problem, you can have a big enough solution. And I would suspect that whether they caused it or not, and if you held a gun to my head and made me guess, I would say they probably did. The globalist faction, such as it is, I think did like the idea of causing this, because what it has done is it has shuffled the deck from a world that was comfortable. And in a lot of ways, even though it was very much in debt, it was increasingly prosperous. You saw America going on a path towards renationalization. China was going on that path. And I think after all the nationalist upheavals, starting really with Brexit, with Trump's election, people like Orban in Hungary and Bolsonaro in Brazil, that the elites striking back is part of the story. And this gave them the excuse to use their sort of unelected powers. The EU, they were talking about falling apart. Now the EU is taking over these countries. And the truth of it is that the people are resisting, they're rebelling, they're revolting in the streets regularly in Europe. And this is a problem for them. But ultimately, they seem confident enough in their control mechanisms between the security states they run and the media operations they have, where they don't really seem to care. And we seem like we're at a position where the sort of war of the elites against the people is hitting a new level. And I guess just for the purposes of edification, it's Christmas Eve, and I'll play professor for you. I don't have a PhD, but damn if I don't deserve one after 13 books. Is that where we had was the French Revolution basically upended the way things used to work. It basically used to be aristocrats told the serfs what to do,
Kings
and they had to suck it up. Precisely that.
Right now, it's very
But
tribal.
what happened was, to fight one another, they had to unleash the forces of nationalism. And if they unleashed it, they had to educate and give people a certain amount of wealth because they needed access to their labor. They never really liked it, but elites have never trusted one another. And so therefore, because they were in competition with one another, they went ahead and unleashed the middle class as a force. And you could look at the battles between between 1789 and between about 1945 that way. But after nationalism proved so destructive, especially in World War II, where whole countries were destroyed and the whole global economy basically had to be rebuilt from scratch, the elites of different countries came together. And I think tellingly, at the heart of this, the communists in charge of the Soviet Union and the capitalists in charge of America, agreed to have a sort of faux war by proxy, the Cold War. Remember, these are both materialist, atheistic philosophies. And they decided that they were going to use a dialectic and work to make the countries like each other. So now, we see America has become a woke ideological background. And we see that Russia, in a lot of ways, has adopted some of the capitalist things. And China even is more of an example as a fusion synthesis with a bring back to the autocracy that now the autonomy of engineering allows. Now, the elites had another problem they had to deal with. They knew in this decade, anywhere from 20 to 60% of people, depending on what estimate you're going to use, were going to lose their jobs to automation. Now they have the built-in excuse to do it because of COVID. So COVID allowed them political cover for the debt bubble. It allowed them political cover for the authoritarian measures. It allowed them political cover for, if you believe as I do, this is genetic engineering and the inclusion of biotech into people. It allowed them to change the fundamental relationship between the state and the citizen to a point where there would be complete control mechanisms. And I think from what I've been watching, every state's on board with this. I watched Putin's 4-hour press conference. The Russians are not going to push against this. The Chinese are pushing into it. The Americans, all the major societies are. And what's interesting is their strategy seems increasingly not to target the people who don't have this and say that they have to have it, but rather to target them for when they try to falsify documents and whatnot to go ahead and integrate back into life. So there's a coordinated effort to redefine the relationship between government and the citizen. And in that, they're very much in agreement. The problem, and this is where the geopolitics get it's interesting, is they are still jockeying for who will be on top. So as we watch this play out, what we're going to learn is how much of it's bluster and how much of it's agreement. And I think the first flashpoint that's going to play out, honestly, is going to be between what's happening in Ukraine and Russia. We'll talk a lot more about that. But with respect to China, China has an economy where they have a little bit of a challenge. They've been the world's exporter and they have all these goods in theory, but they have to have markets to sell them to. And so that's what the Belt and Road Initiative is, because they're losing the West. The onshoring is happening. So they're in a rush to get that sphere of influence done. And they have the ambivalence of a lot of their people. You've done a lot of coverage on China. I know you're familiar with it. So you understand the problem with that over there. But they do have an increasingly large naval presence. They have a stated public desire to go into Taiwan and reintegrate them. I don't know if they necessarily want to do it through force. And they do have the largest economy that is developing, and it will pass the American economy almost certainly in short order. So as we watch this all play out, the problem is nobody in their neighborhood really likes or trusts China. The Russians don't even trust them, but they are working with people and they're trying to break containment, and America's trying to put down containment. So that's kind of the key relationship there. And then the Russians end up being a wild card because they look at Joe Biden as a weak president with a weak hand in a divided country, because one of the things the Chinese understand much more than America does is this idea of cultural warfare. You don't have to defeat a country from the outside, you can defeat it from the inside. And for China, they do it through cultural subversions where they try to put things like woke ideologies, but interestingly, the US tries to promote those same ideologies to destabilize regimes. So we've ended up in a very weird sort of pseudo war that's being fought by I don't know, you say it's like fourth and fifth dimensional warfare means, where you're fighting on the effort of where you get the people and how you break down these societies, because the destructive force of pure military conflict is such that most countries wouldn't contemplate that. However, Russia might be the alternative to that, because Russian basic military doctrine has always been to trade space for time, and that's how they've had a great success. You know, think of all the stories of people invading Russia in winter and dying along the way. But if you can start at the border of eastern Ukraine, the trip to Moscow isn't too much worse than, you know, taking a trip from New York to Maine. And that's the problem for the Russians. That's why they want to go in there, and they don't want to have NATO on their borders. So I think, for what it's worth, I think the Russians are going to push the issue, because I think they understand that the West can't stop them, that they're going to go into Ukraine. And I think tacitly, behind closed doors, I think the West is ready to accept that, because the elites in our own countries, remember, war is the health of the state, and a new Cold War that starts will be the excuse for totalitarian repressive measures that they want, and for massive increases in military spending, which will advance domestic surveillance by amping up the threat of biological terrorism, which you might see, and occasionally you've seen hints in the propaganda that we might say, oh, China's hit COVID out there, they got us sick. And if we took that approach, every country can blame everyone else, and the world starts to look a lot like Orwell's 1984, which is where geopolitics and the sort of geostrategy of the banking class intersect. So I know there's a lot there to unpack, but that's kind of like a broad, maybe introduction for people not familiar with the big scope of what's happening in the geopolitical scene.
So in a lot of ways, a lot of these problems internationally in geopolitics, they cross the lines and have the same endpoint, where they become ultra paranoid within themselves, and they take it out on the population, the hoi polloi, let us say.
They do, absolutely. Part of what they do. And because I mean, you got to remember, people who are screwing people over all the time, which is what professional diplomats and politicians do, cannot help but think and see other people the same way. And one of the real dangers of our current thing is that all of the elites between these different countries think they see the world the same way. But if the Russians actually mean their embrace of orthodoxy, they may see America as a threat because of the wickedness of our views from a Christian perspective. or the Chinese may see it as a vision of complete weakness from their idea of, I mean, they have these crazy ideas of democracy where they treat the whole country as a social organism, and they don't value the individual, they value the collective. So people use words and they don't have the same meanings because they don't have the same cultural space. And, you know, we here in the West tend to look at things very pragmatically, financially. You know, I remember it was in vogue in the 90s. They had this theory that no two countries with McDonald's fought one another because they were too busy getting fat, dumb, and happy.
Golden
and
Arc theory.
Exactly. But we've gotten to the point where, if nothing else was learned from all the time in the sandbox, is that there are people who hold different values, and that civilizational conflict and frankly, radical political change in history does not happen because of people who are quibbling over, you know, wars that are understood. I mean, a perfect example was the long battle between the Parthian Empire of Persia and the Byzantine Empire. And the end outcome winner was the Muslims, the Arab, the caliphates that came out, because they had a radical new conception of things in terms of the Islamic religion that spread. And in a lot of ways, COVID is the sort of black swan where I think we are seeing that. And frankly, you know, you see across countries, there's this hardcore of people, anywhere from 5 to 40% of people who are militantly anti-genetic engineering and this control agenda. And so now you're seeing the global versus national thing play out, where a third force has been enabled that's really going to be an important part of this and hard to determine. And that's people who are just trying to protect their genetic integrity and not get linked into a technological system, while every nation is pushing desperately because of the competitive advantage they think it will give them. Whether it will or won't, you know, who knows? That depends on how much they're being lied to by the people who are promising them these things. But that they're pushing for these systems to be enacted, and that you're seeing mass resistance. And that mass resistance could very well lead to the collapse of certain governments. So it's inherently very destabilizing. But they seem willing to accept those problems. And with respect to America specifically, America's always been a problem because to change the world system would mean to displace America's hegemon. So if you're going to have a new world order, America has to fall first. And whether it's a managed decline, which is what I think the elites would prefer and why they've sort of run this country into the ground, or whether it's a massive attack that comes in, or some other catastrophic scenario, you know, all those guns people like to talk about. The solution for the elites is for us to all turn them on each other, and they're well down the road to doing that. So we'll see how it plays out.
Well, it's definitely, they're walking a tightrope because at the same time they're playing risk and demoralizing and destabilizing the country within. I mean, you're attacking, you know, let's say white Christian males. Well, that's kind of your backbone to what you're trying to accomplish. And you know, I wanted to go back to China for a moment, because what I saw is when I saw this ratcheting up against China, it was around the same time that Taiwan allowed gay marriage, and there was a referendum. The Taiwanese people said no to gay marriage, yet the Supreme Courts of Taiwan overruled the referendum and they allowed gay marriage, and that was the first country, I think, in Asia, or at least far Asia, to allow gay marriage to be legalized. I don't think it's legalized in Thailand. You know, definitely it is in Cambodia and Vietnam. So I thought China saw this as kind of this woke encroachment, where they wanted to push back against a lot of these subversive, malevolent ideologies. And that's where we are today. Trump started the rhetoric against China. And we hear about Hunter Biden and Joe Biden's connections with China. I mean, there was that video of Hunter Biden getting a foot job from some mama-san. So, but we still hear China bad. So that's where I'm still trying to decipher and I'm trying to work this out in my mind, so to speak. What do you see?
Well, here's what I think. I think China's self-interested. I don't think they're good or bad. I mean, in terms of how you'd put that, China is an ethno-nationalist state that favors Han Chinese. To them, talking about racism doesn't even occur as a word because they don't see people who are not like them as people on the same level. It's just truth, and that's common throughout East Asia. That's a problem with the Japanese, the Koreans, and whatnot.
Same anywhere, yeah.
Yeah, and that's most places, and frankly, it's kind of a natural attitude. We are the exception in this. You know, don't want to get into politics of all that, but What I would say is that China, I think, has a view of the world where it wants to be the center of the imperial court, where it wants tribute to flow into it. And what China is doing is setting up a world system where it has people who are coming forward and who are offering tribute and homage. And, working with Russia is an interesting and difficult thing in that sense, but it does give China the ability to break containment. And China's obviously looking for a great power challenge and to step up to be, if not hegemon, at least in a duopoly. In the last month, China has been working for years, apparently, to get a port on the Atlantic Ocean. So to offer some sort of threat to the United States, presumably. And they've succeeded in getting access to be able to station naval forces at Equatorial Guinea, which is off, if you think of Africa where the bump is, down by Nigeria there. Equatorial Guinea's around there. So you're seeing China put out an open blue water fleet that's a direct challenge to the U.S. And one of the things that's not well understood is one of the reasons China has to get to Taiwan if they're going to compete against the U.S. is that the South China Sea is apparently very shallow. And so you can only have submarines. I think it only goes to like 100 feet or something. It's some ridiculously small amount.
It is,
yeah.
There's
surveillance.
There's a battleship and a battle cruiser that's sunk in the South China Sea, and they're only in about 150 to 350 feet of water. So you're right about not being so good with submarines, and that's why you see so many frigates, destroyers, and light cruisers in the area, not submarines.
Right, and if China wants to compete, it's going to need a blue water fleet. But to have a blue water fleet, it needs a blue water port. To have a blue water port, it has to break the first island chain of containment. And this is one of the things you have to understand for the general audience. I know you understand this, but just so they understand, is geography is very important. People, there was a theory that used to say you could understand the whole world by understanding who controlled the main choke points. The Panama Canal, the Suez Canal, the Cape of Good Hope, that's the point of South Africa, the Straits of Malacca. There are these certain places that are really important. And China has been working to get out of containment by building its Silk Road west through Asia. And they've already gotten, I'd say, already to Iran and to Russia. And it's interesting because there is a great opportunity and I think a desire between the Germans and French for rapprochement, especially with China. And that might allow Russia to get what they want, because everyone could get what they want if America gets out of the way. So China is a strategic threat to the United States. It offers an alternate worldview that I think would be popular to aristocrats and bureaucrats in other places. And I think when people look at the United States, they see the discord in our cities. They see the inability of us to manage, our own affairs. They see that I think our debt to income ratio is like 236% based on real GDP. It's awful. So they look at America as something that is a fading and potentially a regional power, and they understand the civil unrest and not just understand it. To be honest, China has been working hard to provoke it with the Confucius Institutes and with things like Charles Lieber. It was what was it called? The 1,000 Talents Project. This guy was getting like 50 grand a month, and this guy was basically doing a bunch of science about how to make transmittable carbon nanotubes in bodies. So basically, he was figuring out how you could link computing to biotech at a small enough level that it could be entered at the cellular level. This is what this guy was doing. And Mike Adams, to his credit, if you're curious about this, I had on Natural News like 2 or 3 days ago. You can find it over on Brighteon. He did about a 90-minute show that was a lot of depth about what Lieber was up to. But the super short version is he was working on the sort of technologies that would interface humanity with technology and wouldn't necessarily need the ability of humanity to know. He was being paid very heavily by the Chinese to do this while he was working with DoD funding at Harvard. And then you have to ask, well, did they know who was working with who? Was he someone who was a turncoat? And this is very complicated because there's a long history in the United States, especially when Democrats were in office, but not exclusively, of seeing ideas. Like, for instance, when Roosevelt was in there, FDR, Harry Hopkins was infamous for rerouting supplies to the Soviet Union before they even went to American troops. And it's no accident that the leakiness of the Roosevelt administration was why Stalin had the atom bomb in 1946, because leftist ideologues have always espoused this sort of globalist Jacobin ideology. And the same sort of thing when you look at what universities support, the idea that there was any sort of fictive loyalty to the United States, especially during the Trump regime, is something that probably wasn't there. So they understand that in America and in the West, we have this concept that, academia is different from government, different from business. And Eastern cultures don't look at it that way. They see it as all part of one state. So they're able to exploit those differences as a form of warfare against us that we perceive as just like natural competition in a sort of capitalist sense. And what I think will ultimately prove the demise of the West is that we think of war in the Westphalian sense of professional armies who line up and shoot at one another, because that was an agreement that was made by European elites to hold the thing together. And that was something we could enforce when we had a clear technological and will advantage. Increasingly, we have neither. And so we are now dealing with a time when a new world paradigm is going to emerge. And the Chinese paradigm of state control of the state basically as an organism run through a sort of professional bureaucrat class, claiming it's a collectivist ideology and enforcing technology on people, is something that's proving very popular globally. And I think even American elites frankly find that model superior to the one they have to deal with within our own country. And that being the problem, as you see our elites try to push measures onto the people of America that many people are just not willing to support, in their efforts to compete against China, they are running directly into the likelihood that they may spawn a civil war.
It would also, there's a lot to unpack on that run right there. Let me tell you, dude.
I don't try to be long-winded. It's just it's late at night. We're talking.
It's great. Hold on one second. I'm thinking about Australia for some weird reason, because I just think of the proximity from China to Australia, and you see the most draconian measures being wheeled out on a nation that's kind of got its pants down. I mean, if you look at its military, it's a lot of American hand-me-downs, a lot of leftovers from the 80s and 90s. I think they just retired the F-111 Aardvark, and that's a pretty old jet bomber and the fastest ever, and they have problems with their submarines. Why would they, if China really wanted to do something to Australia, it could sack Australia quite fast. And you see that, we've kind of left Australia on its own. There's some type of agreement going on. I think with France and Australia, was that with the submarine deal that?
Well, there was AUKUS, which was basically the U.S. and U.K. are going to begin sharing nuclear submarine technology. They displaced the French, and I know there's a ship that's supposed to be coming out there that actually just got completed. I think it's called the USS Canberra, and they're going to rename it and give it over to them. But I mean, when the key thing, if you want to talk about Chinese containment for a minute, in Australia did one smart thing. They got some friends. So there's this informal working group known as the Quad that includes India, which is an increasing military power. You're talking about 1 billion people over there. I think it's 1.1 billion, something like that.
Before you go any further, let's not forget that Russia leases submarines to India, which is a thorn in China's side.
Yeah, Russia's kind of playing both sides against the middle a little bit. Russia and India have historically had very good relationships, and they find themselves on all opposite sides of the line. And I think China would be wise to seek rapprochement with India. China doesn't really want to be, surrounded. And of course, China and Japan are always going to be enemies. That's just the way it is, because of historical grievances going back to World War II that neither side's particularly looking to get past. But in any case, and this was actually another thing, I just read a story today. The Japanese and Americans have begun meeting with a combat plan for what they're going to do for the defense of Taiwan. So those plans are starting to move forward at the same time that we're seeing NATO push into Ukraine. So you can kind of see the forces and the disposition of forces on the map, where it is dangerous, because once you put people on the line and potentially could shoot at one another, things could get badly. But within that, Australia represents sort of like a permanent aircraft carrier. It's not going to be a first strike target for the Chinese, but it has been crazy how deeply they've gone into the COVID agenda. And it almost feels like they've been used as a testing ground for how far people can be pushed, specifically in Melbourne. And I think if I remember right, the state of Victoria, that guy, Dan Andrews, who everyone loves to hate. But, all these countries, they used the idea of crime to go ahead and take away the weapons. Think of the Christchurch thing in New Zealand, and Jacinda Ardern is just awful. And with China, they assumed since China was making so much money off of them, that there would never come a day where that China would go to war. And China, to their credit, presented from the time basically Deng Xiaoping was in power to just a few years ago a very non-militant view that was comforting, and it allowed them to get competitive advantage by getting a monopoly over many key industries through their methods of state capitalism, where they would basically subsidize at cost losing to have control of the market. It's a lot like what Walmart did to take over and destroy a lot of small towns throughout America, where they would come in there, they'd undercut the prices on the 100 most common items, they'd let the other businesses close, and then they'd raise the prices back up. China's done that, but in the post-COVID world and in the rising automation, they're not going to do that anymore. And this is China's problem. China has a strategic advantage, but other economies are more than capable of building infrastructure and money and setting up things to offer competition, I think. And I'm not sure that their social model will prove very productive in the long term. But they do have, much like Russia did in World War II, they have a significant advantage over the world in industrial capacity. And Russia, in the same sort of sense, they have a demographic collapse issue that, that when Putin had his press conference, that's what they were talking about a whole bunch. And he understands with land and space, there'll be time, and that will let them solve their problem because they're trying desperately. I mean, what their response to COVID even talked about was to pay people to have more kids, take care of their kids, and that was the number one thing they were worried about. That people who were worried about the future wouldn't want to have kids. I mean, Putin actually said, I thought this was interesting, it wasn't reported on, he said the collapse in 1991 of the Soviet Union was really a crisis because when people were living week to week to survive, they couldn't imagine having kids, and the birth rate cratered in the Soviet Union. So what they wanted to do in Russia was create a situation to accomplish building up the birth rate. Now, could you imagine a Western politician saying that? I don't think so. We always talk about immigration and replacement to pay for our social welfare services, but where they're looking at their development as who are our people? China's got a bunch of men and not enough women. That usually leads to war. Russia doesn't have not a lot of people, but they have a lot of weapons. That means they have to defend an imperial space. And America has a bunch of people who have been brought in just to make money. So then we go into mercantile adventures. You can see how these different philosophies could interact positively, but they're more likely to grate on one another. And it's those miscommunications that make the world seem so volatile right now, where America defending its mercantile interest against a Russia that needs to expand its imperial periphery, or against a China that basically has an incel problem, is going to have a real problem for potential violence. Because what every state does, and this is one of the key calculations in going to war, states go to war because A, it proves popular to unite the people, and B, because they're scared that if they don't give the people a different target, the people may turn on them. So one of the things that's common but cynical is as things become more difficult in a state, there's always a rush to go to war. And you look at these things and how the Chinese are talking up a war in their propaganda efforts, and the Russians are. You could make the reasonable conclusion that war is a high possibility. And the other point, this is a mechanical military one, but this is a key point, because like the example people use is from World War II. If the Germans had the jet fighter earlier, it might have been a totally different thing in the Battle of Britain, and the whole thing works out differently. Hypersonic missiles are a game changer that can sink the American fleet if the Chinese and Russians can use them in numbers and America doesn't have enough chaff defense. America has been working for years on a laser defense system as the best means to fight this. They have a working prototype, but they don't have the infrastructure deployed. So the calculation you have to make, if you think of it from a war perspective, is if America has a generational shift that would render these hypersonic missiles obsolete, but they're not going to have it deployed for a couple of years, might China and Russia look at this and say, okay, this is the time to have this fight? And I mean, if they've reached the point where they accept that this is a great power competition where coexistence strategies aren't preferable to competitive ones, you may see war come out. And when you start looking into the nuts and bolts of the militaries and the economies involved, China's position, as strong as it appears right now, and as much as they can add more military, is not likely to get that much better going forward, because even the markets they have to go into, they're going to end up in the Western imperial problem. Yeah, they can go and take control in Africa. They can have resource extraction, and they can be as brutal as they want. But one of the things that, the Western BS agenda hides is that imperialism is way more expensive for the colonizing power. And in that sense, China, in all of their adventures, are making the same mistakes that Britain and France did in investing in Africa and investing in these other areas. Yeah, they're getting some goods they need and they're being able to do it, but really they're going to end up incurring more cost than benefit in a lot of different ways. And so their situation, what they have to do to maintain the military strength they're making, kind of forces them, I think, to look a bit expansionist wise. And I think that with Taiwan specifically, you're talking about the semiconductor market and the ability to have control of the productive capacity of a key element of the global economy that buys them more time, which is why I think the Russians and Chinese might be talking and decide, hey, let's make a throw of the dice while the West is a mess. Now, the obvious precursor to that is if, in fact, they've made that calculation, they may very well look at ways of asymmetrical warfare, like cyber warfare, or even COVID biological inserts, whatever it is, different ways to lead the America into fights with one another. Or, you could just have, if you want to be cynical about it, Putin's little green men, right, in Crimea, how hard would it be to cause a couple high profile killings where you could say, hey, it's white people killing black people or black killing, you can see how America's kind of a tinderbox waiting to go forward. And so there's a lot of things they can do, not to mention currency warfare as well, because that's the other piece of this. If America goes into Ukraine, if Russia goes into Ukraine and America doesn't stop it, then what's going to happen is that's going to accelerate the dollar collapse even more, because countries will realize if America can't stop everyone, they don't have to pay basically the vig either, because really at this point, all that's holding up the American dollar is the idea that we can use our military as a hammer against anyone who says they don't want to take our funny money.
I don't know if that's necessarily working anymore. And, this kind of ties into inflation.
Agreed.
If inflation is really at 1% a month, which you floated a couple months ago, the
Russians claim we're at 6% for what it's worth.
But that's almost like a low-grade hyperinflation in a sense.
Indeed. And I think that's borne out. If you go, I do the grocery shopping in my house. I've been watching the prices go up, and I've also been seeing shrinkflation, where you see your 16-ounce can is now 14 and a half, 32 ounces is 28 ounces. And we are seeing all sorts of things in journals like the Atlantic Monthly, the Economist, the sort of ones that elites read to one another, basically saying we should learn to appreciate inflation as a good thing because it hurts the rich more, which is complete BS, by the way.
That's just that's going to cause more destabilization inside the United States.
Sure. Well, and that's the whole thing. Let's jump to the global perspective for 1 second. Destabilization is necessary if you want to get to a single global system, or if you want to have an interlocking global system. I don't care how you want to describe it. So they like this because, remember, their plan, they believe their own BS. They believe in a globalist ideology. They believe there's going to be a single world order, and they believe they're going to be running it. And for their way of looking at it, China just went off the reservation. And
okay, wait. Pause there, because that's what I want to discuss. This is the main factor, the main focus on when did China decided to get off? And what my theory is when the woke ideology was knocking at their door. You saw Zuckerberg with his wife, asking Xi Jinping to name the baby, and he said no. And right then and there was some type of breakdown, because I know Google's been trying to get into China. Facebook obviously wants into China. And for one reason or another, China's like, we're not going up. We're not on board with sustainable development in some ways. So what do you see with that?
I think China has been cannier for a long time. China is a very old country. We're talking 6,000 years going back and forth, different names, but basically the same people. They know how to play the long games. They're the merchants of the Eastern world. And what they are doing I believe, is that they took the money and they agreed basically to allow the West to finance the development of their industry. They promised, we'll be your sweatshop. They took all the money to develop the industry, and they decided, okay, at that point, we want to do things differently. I believe their ideological concerns are incidental to their basic view of nationalism, which is in the Chinese psyche and in the Eastern psyche, pride and saving face plays a huge role. China's derivative thing is the embarrassment that they experienced when the Japanese occupation happened during World War II, and they don't ever want to be in a position to be thought of that way. They want to be the heavy out there. They want to be the number one power, and they view the world in a sort of, I should say, the leadership there view themselves in an optimistic way where they believe they can push forward into anything. I'll give you an example. I was watching a science fiction movie a couple years ago they put out where they literally were having like a moon thrown out of Jupiter. And it's just like something we wouldn't even consider to contemplate, not really. And yet they had these really big ideas in the same way that maybe the Americans did when, we were expanding into the West, after the Civil War, where there was like a redevelopment. And so I think that they've been on this path since at least maybe since Jiang Zemin was in there. I don't know if Deng Xiaoping was in favor of that, but Jiang Zemin was always a nationalist hardliner. We're talking about the mid-late 90s, early aughts. And that's when I think China began really deciding they're going to play this game that way. And they played the long game. They used soft power strategies to develop relationships with the neighbors they wanted to have. The mistakes the West made in not courting Russia into the general Atlantic security alliance. Putin wanted to join NATO. People forget this. Even as late as 2005, that was a possibility. Remember George W. Bush? I looked into his eyes, and this was a man I could trust. And of course,
hey, wait, you do know that Putin stole Robert Kraft's Super Bowl ring, right?
Yeah, I heard that. That's funny to me. I mean, and I'm not here to give you a blanket. I'm a little bit of a Slavophile. I'll put that out there, but for obvious reasons. But Putin has problems too. They all have problems. They're leaders, but Putin, at least, I think, represents the interests of the Russian people more effectively than any of our leaders do the American people. And I think Xi Jinping does the same for China. And I think that they are realizing there was always this big theory in geopolitics called the world island, that if you could control Central Asia, you could control the world. And if Russia and China can leverage that into the various stans, if they can sort of neutralize India and make the rest of it work, and by neutralize, they don't have to go to war. War is totally not necessary. And frankly, it's not in India's interest. I mean, India's sort of being set up to be the new China in the global model for the West, where it will provide more goods and it'll provide some of these offshore services. But I think India has a broader view of themselves, and we're reaching the point where Western finances limits on what it can do are becoming more clear. And this is where it gets tricky to really discern what's happening, but we should try to figure it out, I guess, is that the creme de la creme of the Western elites, the banker class, do they believe that their own future is caught up in the peoples they come from, or do they believe they can shift to these other groups of people? Because frankly, they'd rather have Asian social structures than European ones, because the sort of Oriental Mandarin way of setting up is more stable, and that's what they're looking for: stability, control, and fluidity that works very quickly. And so, are they willing to completely throw the West under the bus? And it seems like they were willing to, but countries have begun pushing back. Like the UK, for instance, was a country that didn't seem like it was really that interested in, kind of being so anti-China. But in the last year or two, they haven't. And there's been speculation. I mean, I can't prove any of it, but there's been speculation that a part of it was because as the new global financial system was coming out, the Bank of England, the City of London, the sort of outsized influence that they've enjoyed has been threatened by a new global order. Maybe, the Rothschild banks, if you want to think about it, I think they're based out of, was it Hamburg or Frankfurt? Right. And the BIS and the Swiss are there. So really what's happened is you've seen sort of the Anglosphere begin, renovating or regenerating itself.
I feel like
they did a terrible job.
When the stock market crashed, right? I don't think they were really necessarily planning on that happening, and they were like, "Oh shit!" It's like right in the boat, iceberg right ahead. So they decided to pump all this money. I really didn't think that their plans were going to be something to this to to this effect, what we're experiencing right now, I really thought it was going to be more the neoliberal model. They kind of just bleed us dry for the next 50 to 70 years, and
Well, the problem is they can't do it anymore, right? Because the debts all come home to roost. I mean, they were up to 50-year bonds, and with the derivative markets, they were able to create more advanced, fanciful instruments.
Hold on, but what if we're already in a different type of economic model? We just don't know it.
Okay, well, what kind of model would you possibly?
I have no idea. That's why I'm asking you. It just,
here's what I think.
Okay, go on.
Since you asked the question, right? Here's what I think. I think the old model was an indirect leverage model that primarily relied on propaganda and finance. I think the new model they want is a direct control model that relies on technology and health. And by that, I mean health. I mean, literally, that what they want to do is they want to include technological circuits into you so that the propaganda is now. The old school would be sending you propaganda to make you think a certain thing. The new school is giving you so many games on your smartphone, you can't look away for 5 seconds to consider anything else, while the other part of your brain is being reappropriated by a chip in you that's letting you have happy thoughts while you're busy being used for something else. I think they've decided that they've gotten to the point where currency may be obsolete. And I know I did a whole show on this. It was a really sort of controversial one. I think you hopefully you had a chance to listen to it. But my argument was, and I'm not saying this is true, but it's a theory that deserves discussion, I think, is that money only matters if you have things of trade and value that are worth to people. And as we sort of don't really have that in the same sort of ways, and we can kind of meet other needs in a UBI world, the means by which control is exerted over people and that leverage is enacted, which is the whole point of finance if you get to it. Because economics is just the control of human behaviors, and finance is the usage of material goods to manipulate those behaviors. If you can go ahead and shift to where you're getting directly into the biology and psychology, you can make finance obsolete. And I think that as we are seeing major technology companies, like think of when Facebook was looking at doing cryptocurrency like Libra, or China's banks experimenting with CDBC, or all the sort of like direct pay models that you see over there, and the AI battle that was happening between the US and China at the same time. Because remember, a lot of these people who are global elites worship this idea of the singularity, and they think there's an all-encompassing AI that's going to kneecap everything else and run the world. So as they shifted to this new struggle, what happens is geopolitics sort of seems like a vestigial organ. But the thing is, it's like you can have all the happy thoughts in your head and you think that's all that matters until someone shoots you in the chest. And so we have these two very different world models coexisting. That's not the right word, overlapping one another in ways that are chafing. And the struggle right now is, can they manage the transition into that new world? And I don't think they can.
Right. How are you supposed to do that without causing black swans and chaos?
Well, and here's the other piece of it. Beyond the interstate competition, there's intrastate competition. Take the 40 million American anti-vaxxers who are going to be taking this. If they say that this is mandated, there's enough people there who believe, I think, who will stand against this, that it would cause mass insurrections and the destruction of this regime. Now, that may not be the case in China, which is one of the arguments that people would make for why, to come back to your first question, why China would release COVID, because they thought they could handle it better than America could. It'd be like you're trapped in a room, like in the Hunger Games, fighting people, and you let a whole hive of bees out because everyone else is allergic and you're not.
Well, that's the point. China's like, we're not going to go along with all this, the transgender industrial complex, though they did just open a sex reassignment hospital, I think in Shanghai. And just like that, China was not that strong, right? But what if perhaps like parts of the U.S. break off and implement this? Obviously we're seeing this mass internal migration, a lot more. I think almost 800,000 people on paper have moved to.
Everyone is moving to the South because they hate the mandates. And even the people like out West, people moving out of California, moving to Montana, I worry, and I'm not I don't want to speak ill of people because I understand why they're doing it, but I worry if the system really hates people who think that way, and everyone who thinks that way goes to a certain area,
Oh
what
yeah.
might happen. I mean, look, I admit my job is to be the prophet of the paranoid, right? That's what I do. My job is to scare the crap out of you at 6 a.m. But it is a legitimate concern, and it is a danger when the government has shown itself in a way that is not has no probably has no recent analog in American history to demonize its own people. I mean, even for all the terrible things people said about Trump or any Republican, they've never said, well, we think these people are evil or bad. I mean, you haven't seen anything like that since McCarthy. And I would even argue McCarthyism at its strongest wasn't like what we are seeing about, that social media is enabling this echo chamber. It could be AI driven as well. This is, these people are bad. They need to die. They're killing us. And when I was watching, I watched Biden's presser the other day, and what struck me was this was not a presser being put for all Americans. This was basically a reinforcement propaganda message to people who are on board with the agenda, telling them you are good and these bad people are hurting you, but we won't let them. And that they are getting ready to paint it, much like what happened in Rwanda with Hutus and Tutsis. Actually, it's a very similar sort of message and modeling. And for people who are trying to be, purebloods, it's something you need to be concerned about, because this can go downhill very, very quickly. You have one strain go out there where, let's say some of that Lieber technology gets employed and a bunch of people get sick, and who knows, maybe if it, depending on what's in the environment, maybe you can get people who are not vax sick and you can blame it on this. You could see very quickly people get turned on in these countries. I mean, it's the old Milgram experiment, right? 2/3 of the people are willing to turn on 1/3 at any time. A third will go ahead and actively persecute it. A third will look the other way, and the other third will be gone.
Right.
That's reality.
It's a reptilian mindset.
It's the reality of it, and people don't want to believe that. People want to believe comfortable ideologies and the battles that exist before COVID matters. We're in a new world, but we don't understand the rules of it yet.
Well, I was on the phone with some of my fellow expat friends. You got the vaccine passport in certain countries in South America, loosely enforced, but it is there. So
and I saw Ecuador just put it in.
Yeah, well, you know what it is? Is like the groundwork is being set. You're going in a much more controlled, mass surveillance type of scenario.
Sure. And I mean, the thing is, what do you do if you don't want to be a party to that? And I think dissidents are going to realize very quickly in 2022, as new measures get pushed out there, there's nothing that can be done. There's no political solution to this. And that ultimately that they're going to have to either opt for large area autonomy, sort of like the Florida solution, or you may see them move towards more violent measures depending on how far the government's willing to go. If the American government tried to enact the measures which were being put on the Australian, we would be in a shooting war. And to their credit, I think they know that. But I think also, I mean, unless they're willing to get out of this agenda and then just say, okay, well, we've got the people who we can get on board. And are you willing to do that? Because then you have a bifurcated future. And I mean, if we assume, and it seems like every country's on board with this, that the vaccine passports are the end goal, at least the intermediate goal. Let's say the idea that you have complete biometric ID that's caught up in your financial system and has all your data, and that you have in a country 40% of the people actively resisting that, as opposed to other countries which have 5%. The government is going to almost feel forced, and they very well may be by, call it the World Health Organization, call it the IMF, whomever you want to, the idea of international trade. You'll find these global institutions will exert pressure to say, why aren't you part of the club? And the politicians all love being part of the club. So they'll be like, oh, we can get them. America can get our people on board just as much as China. And it's that sort of like push that has a total lack of understanding of what they, what they call flyover country, that offers a real problem where war may be coming. And at some point, all it will take is the wrong person being prosecuted and persecuted. And right now, people aren't organizing because technology is basically a honeypot. I think one of the interesting things people to follow might be that case of, the Michigan militia who's going to kidnap Gretchen Whitmer. And it turns out the more comes out this case, it was all feds.
Yeah.
It's like for every person involved, there was FBI agents. And so really the reason nothing happens is because nothing can happen. But you get to the point where you have so much apathy and atrophy. Let's say that Russia decides they're going to push into Ukraine. Who's going to go fight? You going to send a bunch of trannies from the village? I mean, what are you going to do? Because I tell you what, John Q. Cornboy doesn't want to fight for this country anymore because he knows it's bullshit.
Now let's going back to what we were dancing around the topic of internal migration. By the way, that show we did on New England was fantastic, and we kind of now people are moving to the South, right? And
yes.
And people are gravitating towards the South for the very obvious reason is that it hasn't really let go of its past in a lot of different ways. Obviously, there's some areas have turned purple, and obviously,
I think the South has an active mythology. I wouldn't say the South is like the old South, but I would say at least the South has.
There's still like an underpinning. There's still a foundation which it's built upon.
There's an aspiration. I'd agree to that.
Right. So people are moving to Florida. Florida is not a safe place to be. And you see that now California is going to be mostly, is kind of this Tower of Babel mystery meat with Chinese, Hispanics. I mean, black people are moving out of there in droves and been moving out since after the LA riots. And you're also seeing, kind of the white middle class of the New England region, the tri-state region also moved down. And the elderly people are already here. So, there's a lot of old, white people.
Sure. I mean, and let's be honest. Old people move to Florida because there's no taxes and it's warm. I mean, arthritis is a thing. I shovel snow in 0 degree weather.
It's not a good place to be, long term. And that leaves open the Ozarks and the whole middle region. And what I'm afraid of, looking at this as in the realm of the geopolitics, is that you've cut off yourself from a lot of ports, which is not good. And you could see this being somewhat of a problem long term, where basically we're segregating ourselves. It's huge. It's white flight on steroids.
It's people are chasing politics instead of chasing culture. For people who've known my work for a while, I'm in the past, before COVID, I was a pretty prominent secessionist. I still think it's a good idea for what it's worth, but I have more practical things I have to focus on. And we used to argue that Northern New England should secede because we have demographics that have more cultural and ethnic homogeneity than a lot of other places. We have communal things. The far Northeast could be America's Norway, if you want to think of it that way, with all the good and bad, including the fact that there's a whole bunch of gas off the coast of Nova Scotia, neither here nor there. But the argument I used to always have to make is people like, well, you don't understand. We need Republicans. We need that. I mean, the reason why the politics are terrible in my neck of the woods is because people don't have the problems to understand why the politics can't afford to be that terrible, which is a funny thing. But the point I'm making is that when you pick where you want to be, there are certain fundamentals of it. And picking a sandbar that's 300 feet high and, however many 100 miles long isn't necessarily a great point. Yes, it might be comfortable. Yes, the beach might be fun. Yes, the politics might be good right now. But you know what? In the fullness of time, that is not going to be a long-term foundation. And then you have to look at where it makes sense for, a new state to begin forming itself. And when I say state, I mean it as a new nation. America is an empire. It was a republic that became an empire when it picked up the British imperial responsibilities, thanks to bankers after World War I and World War II. And it destroyed what should have been a natural progression, probably to include America and Canada as a single separate republic. Because imagine if America doesn't support Britain in World War I and World War II, Britain probably loses, Canada probably joins America, and we're happier, richer, and more comfortable. However, we have bankers, so instead we have states in Palestine and whatnot. You know how that worked out. Balfour Declaration, if you don't know your history. What ends up happening, though, is that we ended up being this imperial overreach where basically after the National Security Act of 1947, America never came home after World War II, and now we're completely spent. We had to have a couple attacks on us like 9/11 to keep the ball going, but there is nothing left other than the fact that we might fight each other over the scraps and over the ability to survive. And then you have to think where you want to be and where a culture can rebuild itself. And for reasons you've discussed, the Republican South, and I'd say a lot of other places actually. You know, I saw the same thing when I was in Boise. I went out there in 2019 to visit them, and the people didn't want the Californians there. They understood it was a problem. They saw the Californians were doing what they do. They were building NGOs. They were getting into local things that they didn't want to do. And they said to the Republican Party, stop this. And the Republican Party said to them, but this is building so much economic growth. And so they're screwed. And you can see how the story's going to go. Boise will be to Idaho what Portland is to Oregon within 10 years. I have no doubt of it. And then where are they going to move? North Dakota? And this whole idea that you flee in the face of a cultural model because you're not willing to fight it. You know, the live and let live model that the American right embraces is a surrender model. It's worse than French military doctrine of the Second World War. Something different's needed, and that's why I've said and I've predicted that, and you're starting to see it, is you're seeing new things emerge. The alt-right tried to do it through ethnos, that didn't work. Look for theocracy to be the next thing because people are disgusted in the woke ideologies, and it's something that will prove popular for families and people who want to stand and believe in something. If people won't fight for their lives, perhaps they'll fight for decency, God's will, and their soul. I mean, that's what I talk about. But will you see that down south? Well, we could get into that, but there are problems there because the rife commercialism. Success teaches bad lessons, whereas the hardness that has to develop in a lot of ways in Americans really is, you know, people ask me all the time why nothing changes. And the answer is really, really simple. America's so rich, nothing is bad enough yet. But we're starting to see hints of what that might look like. And it will be interesting to see where resistance comes from. Because on the one hand, there's the mass of people in a place like Florida, but even a governor as, you know, likable in a lot of ways as DeSantis is he really willing to be the guy who's going to go that next step? A lot of us thought and hoped maybe Trump would be that guy, but he turned out being a buffoon of a demagogue who's destroying his own political credibility right now because he wants to be liked by the elites. And when you look at it, there's no one else out there. So really, when I look at 2022 from the American domestic perspective, what I'm looking at is two things. I'm looking at if we will get ourselves drawn into a war because other countries will see our weakness, and then when that comes forward, what ability will the American government have to push cohesion? Because if the American government thinks it's going to fight a military war on two different fronts, and probably three fronts, it'll be a Middle Eastern front. Don't forget Iran. They have a lot of things they want to do in the Sunni world. Are they going to ask sacrifices to be coming from the same people that just kicked out of the military? And I think they will find, much like the Tsarist Russia did in 1914, that they may see insurrections begin happening with great speed in this country. And that's why America can't fight the war. But if they don't fight the war, the dollar collapses, and then the country begins falling in on itself. It's a really bad spot America's got itself into, and weakness begets weakness.
Okay, so let me ask you something. Now, could a situation where if inflation continues at the rate it's going, more people become more, I guess, scared of the other, introvert, this bugman lifestyle, coupled with the, you know, people with their creature comforts and stuff like that? Do you see a situation where the federal government will not be able to hold on to certain regions of the United States and will somewhat start looking like our neighbors of the South in Mexico, where there's certain areas where the federal government just doesn't even bother? Like let's say OSHA goes to like the, you know, Weaselburg, America. Like, are they really going to try enforcing some of these type of mandates and these draconian measures to certain parts that are just totally not okay with it? And you know, when we were talking to Eke Lux, he was on recently, he says that California's become much more tribal. And Victor David Hansen, I don't know if you follow him or not, he's pretty cool. He's a good guy. He's a good guy. He's saying that America's just going to descend to various tribes where you look out for your first cousin over your fellow citizen. And being an Italian, that's like, oh, well, obviously you do that. But there's certain parts of America and there's certain white people that don't think in these terms.
You know what? Gangs of New York would be the city, or would be the movie, right? I mean, in a lot of ways, that's a good example of what that actually looks like in real life experience.
Well, I'm trying to explain to people down here about, you know, coworkers asking for kickbacks and people taking care, doing money in cash, cash. Like in New York, it's quite common that you pay cash for stuff because you want a discount or something like that, right? In other parts of the United States, they think you're just you're an unscrupulous
Well, by their logic, you are unscrupulous, but people don't understand that cities build their own mechanisms. Like the unions made mechanisms to protect their members. I was a teamster. I get it. You got to know a guy. Sometimes you got to grease the skids a little bit to make things happen. And on the one hand, it sounds unfair, but you know what? You're never going to get rid of nepotism unless you want to get rid of family values. And families looking out for each other is the nature of the world. The fact that we pretend it's not is one of those American ideological delusions. In a lot of ways, the inner city that does that is closer to the reality of what that world's going to be like. And I think people who are used to thinking, I go, I pay my bills, I do the right thing, and I expect things to work out, they're going to be some of the people most blindsided by this system, because doing the right thing doesn't save you as things begin falling off. The question isn't what is right, it's who your friends are. And if you have a whole bunch of friends who stand together for what's right, that's great. But ultimately, you need friends.
Yeah, but so what I'm thinking is, we're looking at that, and at the same time, we're looking at the transhumanist agenda. Two total opposite ways of life. Let's face facts. So it's really hard that we're walking this tightrope where it's like, okay, it's either we're going to descend into tribalism, and women will revert back to being their gender and their sex, and guys are going to start exerting some type of force. But at the same time, we're talking about this transhumanist where I can be a 21-year-old white girl, but in reality, I'm a fat black dude, right? So
but you know what? It's less than you think for this one reason. And what you could have, and what you've already seen in regentrification, is urban areas are going that way. Think of the book Brave New World, if you want an example, how the dissenters ended up on reservations where they were left alone, and where the other people chose to be in society. And society, they had, you could take the megapole running from Boston to Washington, and just cart that off and say, okay, we're going to be out there, and you can have automation for the farms and go kill the little people who want to own things. They want to be apart from it. And that is a viable strategy for them if automation and technology have come far enough. I mean, what do you actually need to control, and how much damage can you do against incipient resistance movements? And I mean, people do think that way. That's how the Bolsheviks beat the White Russians. The White Russians had numbers advantage, they had the morale advantage, but they had inferior leadership. And after the whole Tsarist family was assassinated, the Russians could never put the pieces together, and they were able to take advantage of their control and superior organization, and they were able to spread outwards. And I think the elite model basically sort of emulates that even to today.
Let me interject. So, but here's the problem: who are they using exactly to enforce? Like, you can't look at Soviet Russia, the Russian Revolution, compared to the ideologies being waged here. I mean, you have what? It's an island of misfit toys, as to coin a term junk you.
Well, you have automation. You have those stupid robot dogs that Boston Dynamics is making. We're not far from it. And to go even further, I mean, if you really want to think of it, if transhumanism does what it professes it's going to do, and you see things like Neuralink that Elon Musk is talking about become common, 5 years from now, it probably wouldn't be much of a thing for, an unscrupulous agency to take someone who has an existing chip, plant a suggestion. I mean, it's like Minority Report. You could have the perfect crime because you have a population that's subject to hijacking. And I know we are not comfortable with imagining a future where we are not fully autonomous sovereign beings, but I'm telling you, all the research money, all the efforts, and all these governments are pushing hard into this. The technologies are already extant. The only thing that's lacking, as far as we know, and I'm not even sure about this, is the infrastructure. So the idea that you're going to have a choice, or rather that I should say the people are going to have a choice, is a difficult one. And I'll just give you an example, a very simple one that I actually believe will happen. If, in fact, the COVID vaccines do lead to antibody-dependent enhancement, where people are basically going to die if they don't get further treatments, they're on a lifelong subscription model. And it wouldn't be much of a thing for the government to say, well, you could either die because we made a mistake, or we have this newly upgraded chip that will heal you, plus it will do this, and that. And the this, and that could be anything they want it to be, if the alternative side of it is to death, dismemberment, disease, and suffering. And I think that is a big part of the agenda. And I think that's the other shoe that's going to drop. And when it does, I think a great many people will do what most people do is they'll do whatever it takes to save their own skins. And the people who stood on the outside this whole time, who didn't fall for the thing, are going to be facing weaponized people against us. And I think this is going to be a problem in many countries, but especially here in America.
Well, okay, now what if it's just the top-heavy demographic that's dictating a lot of these policies? I mean, let's be real. Who's lining up to get their fifth and sixth top up? It's Boomer. You take a look at who's running anyone in the ruling class at this point is geriatric. I mean, Biden. Did you see Biden today? He said, "Let's go, Brandon." It's like. So in Pelosi's 80. So do you think in a lot of sense that perhaps the neoliberal world model and globalization as we know it is in its twilight because these people that are running the show are also realizing they're not
maybe, but my counterpoint would be that I don't think these people run the show. I think they're the puppets. I think at the end of the day, the people who run the banks and the tech companies run the show. And I think they use politicians as disposable. And if you look at America being set up for a fall as part of a introduction of a new world order, of a system update, then the whole thing starts to make a lot more sense. I mean, we obviously have a corrupt and decrepit class, and it does strike me that the best way, perhaps the new world order, if we want to call them that, whatever you want to call them, whoever the people waiting in the wings, would be to decapitate that whole class, say they're all corrupt,
Right.
maybe take them down with Maxwell or with Epstein and say, we have a new order, maybe put it under military leadership or something, well, whoever it has to be, not Milley, obviously, and say, we are going to give justice, because people are begging for something better. You know, if Trump had been willing to cross the Rubicon in 2020, even with all his well understood faults, he would have had enough support to go ahead and start that conflict and potentially win it. And so the desire that exists in the American people for something better is very clear, with at least a large enough portion of the population, which creates an opportunity if there are people who have the leverage to remove the people who are in power. And since we've seen the heaviness of the corruption, you know, in people like Pelosi, McConnell, Schumer, whoever you want to go through, the whole list of them, that's there, I mean, that card could be played. And ultimately, you would still see the technology move forward. And in a lot of ways, keep this in mind too. The reason why a lot of technologies get adopted isn't because government mandates it. We choose to do it. I mean, smartphones, I would say, as a net, are probably a negative to privacy and to how we conduct ourselves. And yet we all choose to do it. Hell, we even pay for the surveillance that's done to us. So there are lots of different ways you can go about this. And I think we need to get a broader view of power than thinking the political class actually exercise it. Unless the political class is willing to use force and violence, it doesn't have a lot of tools. And if you want to take a step back to talk about how we got into this mess and why the system broke, it's because the politicians lost the monopoly on violence a long time ago. You know, it started with the private security contractors, both at war and for the security forces at home. It started with, sanctuary cities, and that we're going to enforce these laws, not enforce these laws. So now there's divided structures of who has force and violence, that it's highly individualized and groupized. The tribalism that you talked about, that Davis Hansen was talking about, is happening. And at this point, you're not going to stop it. I think I was reading the other day, in 1980, for every one paid operator, like mercenary, there were 30 soldiers in the army or something. And now it's like there's 3 soldiers for every one paid contractor. So we're back to the old mercenary armies of the 16th century, and that's sale by bidder. And that's the world we're going into, a world where there are sources of power that are blended. You may see, as you see in the Third World or in Africa, you may see that corporations have their own armies, like they do often in resource extraction.
Resident Evil.
Sure, well, Raccoon City, right? Absolutely, things like that, and we are moving down that trail because the American government, whatever other things you say about it, and has a critical lack of confidence and division. The schism between the people in this country has become too great to be, papered over. And even if they got into a war with Russia and China, I'll just tell you straight up, if we got into a war with Russia, I wouldn't think we were the good guys. So take that for what it's worth.
Well, I had a really nice conversation with someone that worked in the State Department a long time ago, shooting the shit, and he was point point blank and with confidence, he said America can never wage a war like it did in the past because it would break out in a civil war. So if we were to go fight another country, we'd automatically lose because there'd be so much infighting inside the United States. You look at Vietnam where there was the cases of GIs fragging their lieutenants, their platoon commanders, that was in the, we're talking 60 years ago, almost, 50 plus years. And now you saw that type of individualism, right? Where you could never frag your commanding officer during World War II. I'm sure there were some cases, but in the past, you can never get away with something like that. And with the way it is today, where everyone thinks they're an island unto themselves, I can't see how on earth we'd be able to wage a war against someone like Russia that seems to has rekindled its orthodox roots.
Well, and that's the other thing. American war doctrine has tried to hide behind technology basically since World War II, understanding this. And it really came out of Vietnam, and the Americans didn't want to pay for a war with casualties.
If you ever read the book called The Perfect War, and it's basically managers, basically that we could just overpower an enemy with our finances and our technology, and it didn't work out.
And that's why we haven't fought a real first level opponent. And a first level opponent that would attack us. Look, America could be taken down in a week. Imagine 10 days without electricity in the United States and what would be there when the power came back on.
It's a horrifying
That's how you win the war. And you know what the thing is? You don't even have to do it. You can just say it's a virus. You can do it by proxy. You can blame it on the Iranians.
Okay, I'm going to interject here. I'm going to hold you back. You want to know why?
Yeah.
Human psychology is very complicated. Sometimes you think of like a stampede or a riot. Not everything turns into like these type of scenarios. A good point I'd like to point out. Do you remember the power grid crash in 2003, August of 2003, for the whole New England and New York, Manhattan? Do you remember that?
I was vaguely. I was in Pennsylvania at the time, but yeah, I remember it happened.
So everything went out, okay? And my parents were scared because they were thinking about what had happened in the 70s during the blackouts in the summer of like 1975 or 76, where it's just total anarchy. It's just chaos everywhere.
My mother was in New York, where I heard about that one.
Right. It was pandemonium. People settling old beefs, old grudges, robbing convenience stores, so on and so forth.
Of course, New York in the 70s had a lot of problems.
True, but then what happened? But here comes 2003, and nothing happened. Everyone was actually barbecuing, having a good time, and not really thinking all that much of it.
But in 2003, we had a common enemy that had a lot of validity at that time. We were still in the honeymoon period before Iraq and after Afghanistan, where people were feeling good about what America had accomplished.
Yeah, everyone had money. Everyone was doing well at that time.
Yeah. So right now, if it happens, I think that the paranoia and the uncertainty and more importantly, I think the logistics lines, people are in the cities. I just don't think the support, there's not this idea that we're in this together. And you need national unity if you're going to have a nation. And I don't see how it is even possible to rekindle that. I mean, to be honest with you, I think Obama killed it. And I'm not saying him alone. I mean, Lord knows the Bushes were terrible, but these people were terrible for different reasons. And the idea of and my own thought on it was after the elites got really spooked after Occupy Wall Street and the End the Fed movements, because leftists and rightists were talking to each other and seeing the common enemy was finance. And it was no accident at that same time that all the big corporations started funding all these woke ideologies unto death, where they literally were propagandizing the college universities. They were determined to have activists at war against one another to save their own financial hegemony. And they've succeeded so well that they broke the country in the process.
Right. Yeah. Totally see that. Totally get where that could that happen. So it's pretty it's you know what it is like people that have these type of red pill glasses on. I just you can't keep your head away from it. I know I can't. I'm maybe not as tied up in it as you are, where you're constantly venturing down rabbit holes and different labyrinths in your brain. But once you start seeing things for what they are and not what you want them to be or wish they could be, thinking like a normie, thinking like a lefty, thinking like a person that's got his third booster, it's hard to walk away. It's hard to ignore.
Well, but I mean, the thing is, a lot of people do, and the reason they do is because they have to. Say you have a couple kids, or you're in a position. I get the luxury of being aware of things because my liabilities are limited to myself and my wife, so I can afford to think of certain things. But if I had, let's say, I had kids that were 6, 3, and 2 years old, I need to believe there's going to be a future because it's for them. And so there's always that hook by which a lot of people are held in, and that's why a lot of people end up taking the jab for their job, and those sort of compulsive measures work. And once they're on board, they figure I might as well be all the way on board because if I've already given this sacrifice, and that's why they're able to kind of keep it going. But the question is if there are enough people outside the society, and that's why they attack things by saying, like, there's now a huge amount of men who don't go to college, who don't have girlfriends, who are in this population. It's going to be a problem. Well, you made it that way.
Right.
You broke it. And we're going right into your wheelhouse, right? But that's the problem. And frankly, China has the same problem. I mean, Russia doesn't have the problem because they don't have men, which is why maybe we need to go invade and get Ukrainian war brides for all our boys. But I don't know. But my point is that we have systems which are just so out of sync, and where we have all these divisions and we have the inability to put the pieces back together, that I think right now this thing is just coasting on inertia. But the next major shock, I mean, the thing that held America together, to be honest, was the greed that, hey, at least we could all be rich, and we could be rich enough to insulate ourselves from others so we didn't have to worry about it.
Right.
Take away America's wealth, and these other sovereign powers like Russia and China can do it, and they're starting to do it, trading oil directly between one another, building alternatives. Once Nord Stream comes online, Germans buying oil from them. It's not going to be long before America's dollar breaks. And when America's dollar breaks, what are they going to do? I mean, ultimately, you have balkanization, chaos, or you're going to have an imperial model come in where you're going to have someone basically ruled by fiat, and you'll have to have UBI, and people's base needs might be met at that point, but it'll be a very different country. But
what's their obsession with lying to the people so much?
What's what now?
The amount of lies, that's what shocks me and horrifies me. At least with the previous administrations, we knew the government was lying, but they're a little crazy, but at least they're not turning on the people and acting somewhat belligerent. Since I would say Obama's second term, the mask started to fall off and they started acting acting quite schizophrenic. Why did that happen? What was the reason behind where they started promoting things like transgenders and saying women are now?
Well, it could be. There's an argument that's made. Catherine Austin Fitts makes the argument better than I will, but it basically goes like this. They realized just how broken the financial system was. We've pretty much been nonstop at quantitative easing since 2007, which is inflation city. And they can't get away from it. In fact, they were trying to look to get away from it, and they literally just cannot do it. And so because of that, they need other fall guys. So every one of these distractions, whether it be BLM and the Floyd protests, or whether it be COVID lockdowns, or whether it be all the other things we've seen, all of them ultimately, if we're fighting over that, we're not looking at how impoverished we're getting. And then all of these crises are presented as reasonable explanations and problems for what's happening, which is realistically, let's say COVID wasn't happening, but we were still spending at this level, we would still have the inflation problem. We would still have the problem of people being dispossessed of their jobs. We would still have all these other things, and the chaos allows them to mask responsibility for what has been a really unsuccessful policy. And I think since they've realized they've been broke, they've had to engineer a passage. And I think this is really the story that in history will get written between 2007 and whenever they get the vaccine passport control central bank digital currency system in place, is that they were trying to transition by money by fiat, by the suggestion of leverage finance, to a direct control system, and that they had to have enough time, and they're trying to buy time through crises, political time, we should say, by not having the people organize against them. Because ultimately, we're still basically suffering and miserable for a fiat system that where the money has no value. And and it's interesting to look at the crypto markets in this regard, because it's shown that there are alternatives that can prove popular, and yet those are being threatened with regulation because they want to have that central control model, because the debt bubble might be the whole story, that all these things happened because they needed to explain away and buy time to get out of the debt bubble.
Well, during like between the economic crash of '08 up until when Trump got into office, you saw big finance start to leverage internationally. So you had Wall Street, I'm sorry, the New York Stock Exchange open up to China. I don't know if you've seen that documentary called what the hell? Not the Big Short. Anyway, it was about Chinese penny stocks, where China Hustle's the name of it. Really good documentary. Recommend everyone go check it out. So in 2010, 2011, 2012, Wall Street was like, okay, well, where are we going to go now? Because we kind of imploded our own economic system. So they started looking internationally. It's where you start getting these ETFs that are for international development and, green energy in Southeast Asia, so on and so forth, things like that. And when they made that pitch, they also started letting foreign capital flow into the United States. We talk about the EB-5 visa. That's it. I'm sure you're fully aware of what that is. And during the COVID, Lindsey Graham and Chuck Schumer wanted to modify the EB-5 visa to allow even more Chinese in. Right during this is in May of 2020. They tried doing something like this. So it really made me wonder, is it just they're just trying to bleed the whole world dry to keep their system afloat because of how over leveraged they are?
Well, keep in mind this too. I mean, on some level, I think that they have to just finish. One thing we see is the financialization of absolutely everything because it buys time. But another thing to remember is a lot of the people who are politicians who are at the highest level are midwits. So they're just doing what they're told, and they kind of believe their own ideologies. The conversation you and I are having, I don't know if all of them can understand it. I know the squad sure the hell can't. And your average Republican, I'm not so confident about them either. So they don't understand. And because if people understood the way money worked, the world wouldn't work the way it does. I mean, that's the simplest explanation, right? So I do think that people are sort of frustrated about the sellout. They're frustrated about the migration of populations. And yet with COVID, there's a distraction that shifts the narrative. I mean, it's the same trick they pulled with January 6th. People aren't talking about a stolen election when they're talking about what it was and was not an insurrection. And the whole thing, in sales, they call it talking past the sale. And what we have seen is they just keep talking past the sale, and they basically are shouting propaganda as loud as they can, blowing people off from platforms like myself, who's on another sabbatical from YouTube. And what they do is they're getting enough people, I guess, and they feel confident enough that they're just pushing forward with it. Now, whether that's a position of strength or weakness, we don't have the research to know. To me, it feels like weakness, but that's what they're doing. And, maybe they decided after COVID that after they stopped everything, and maybe like I did with Coronavirus Central, a lot of people might have just made the conclusion this was that deadly. I remember in February of 2020, I was saying that I thought if what had happened in Wuhan had been replicated worldwide, I was predicting an 8-figure death toll in the United States of real people dying, not people, who commit suicide and are being accused of dying from COVID. But which is a hustle by the hospitals, which is what they're doing because they're being pushed into medically getting rid of people, and they bring in the National Guard people like they did up here in Maine. It's a mess.
Filipinos.
Precisely that. and so when you look at this and you look at that whole mess, I mean, they might have thought, and I thought, I mean, legitimately, that, the shutdown was what to do. And there's a lot of people, I'll just say this, there's a lot of people when COVID broke who's like, I'm not going to do that. I'm not scared. If you weren't scared when COVID first broke out, you're an idiot, because it did look like it was terrible and it was a real risk. And we may deal with a pandemic that bad at some point. But if you still were believing it was that big a risk when the elites were letting BLM parade through the streets and say, well, racial justice is more important than pandemic safety, then you were also an idiot. And sometimes sometimes you have to kind of follow the narrative, and you have to play along, and you have to be a little safe. And I say that for one reason. I think there's a very real chance before this is all said and done, we have something happen where a bunch of people do get sick and die. And yes, I do believe that the long-term consequences of taking the injections will do that. However, I would not put it past them. If certain people think it's to their advantage, it's not a hard thing for people with the sort of resources of these groups or these nations at war with one another covertly to release a sort of biological thing. And I think nations recognize that. There was a story this week about the U.S. Army working on this new spike variant vax thing. It's supposed to be this 22-sided spike thing.
Pills now? They got a pill coming out?
Yeah, the Merck's got the pill. They got all this stuff. And part of that is, it's ethnic biological warfare where they've been, going back to the 90s, the Israelis were working on, genetic warfare triggers and targets. And you were reading these stories out of, I think there was one out of California. There was also one a month ago out of London about how Chinese companies are buying DNA samples from these databases so they can build DNA profiles of the American population. So they know, all right, well, if we want to kill the most people or maybe not kill, who knows, maybe maim, because that's the one thing, like we're going to see in the year ahead, people are going to die from weird things. They'll be labeled different things. And in response, what it really is a broken immune system and external environmental triggers that are modulating what's being done with whatever these mRNA inserts are. And we don't know. We know some of the things that can be done. We have suppositions, but
hey,
we don't know what we're dealing with.
I remember when I first started following you, you read parts of Carl Schwab's book, The Fourth Industrial Revolution. That was when you had your little Pato bean. That was horrifying what he had written in that book.
Oh yeah,
a goosebump horror.
Well, if you want to read Globalism for Globalists, go read Homo Deus by Yuval, what's his name, Noah Levine or whatever his name is. That's the go-to book where they imagine what they're going to do. And to their credit, the one thing I will give credit for these people for, the people who are doing these technocratic humanists, is they are very upfront about what they want to do. They have immense amounts of resources and they're going for it. They believe the future is theirs. They believe it with the faith and zealotry of a religion and the religion of scientism that they've enabled, people who trust the science. They say, trust the dogma, and like you would like medieval mass. And that's why I think, in the future, when you get to tribes, and you're fighting then, the way you organize tribes is through crusades and holy wars. That's what you're going to see in the future. And you're going to see wars of science against traditionalism and the forces that will emerge for that, because ultimately everything else is being taken from us. That's my belief. I could be wrong, but that's how the Dark Ages happened the first time.
Sidestepping for just a moment, because I don't want to keep you on for too much longer. Afghanistan. I'm going to give you my opinion on Afghanistan. A lot of people disagree with my little random armchair thesis.
Okay.
To be a buffer between us and China, where we started arming the Taliban, and then the Uyghurs are located in that region just north of Afghanistan. And we've already had a long history being friends with the Taliban. And, we saw that there was such a pitch and not a vilifying of the Taliban as we pulled out. And the way we pulled out was, obviously a bit of embarrassment, but at the same time, nothing's done, randomly. I just, the way we pulled out and how much ammo and weaponry left behind, it makes me wonder, are we now friends with the Taliban again, acting as a buffer towards China? What do you think?
Well, I tend to be skeptical of that. I don't want to say it's impossible, but you can't understand America's relationship with Afghanistan without understanding America's relationship with Pakistan. The Taliban was put into place by the ISI. That's their secret service.
We were talking about this. Me and you.
Right. And what I think what changes this is Afghanistan is generally friendly to Pakistan. Pakistan and India hate one another. America historically was friendly to Pakistan because Russia was friendly with India. And while Russia has remained friendly with India, America and India have become way friendlier. And in the post-Musharraf years, America and Pakistan have become a much more strained relationship. And in fact, China is doing a major investment to have a blue water port just off Karachi.
Yeah,
over there. Yeah. So I think that being the case and them being part of Silk Road, I tend to see what happened in Afghanistan as the actions of a corrupt administration that is, I believe that in some meaningful way, the Chinese have their hooks into the Biden administration. I believe this was a deliberate failure that was set forward. Now, whether it's part of a larger global plan, I can't tell you. But I don't believe we have a good relationship with Afghanistan. I don't believe we have a terrible relationship with the Taliban. I don't think that's the case at all. Business is business, because states will do that. But I think as much as America has a bad relationship, or I should say a strained relationship with Pakistan, I don't believe we have good relationships in that area. And I actually wonder, to be honest with you, how good our relationship is with India. When that AUKUS alliance was announced that we talked about at the beginning between Australia, the UK, and the US, I remember reading stories saying that Japan and India wanted to be part of it as they were part of the Quad. And basically Biden went out there and said, you're not like us, you're not going to be in it. And at that point, if he did that, in fact, that would have alienated them from us. And if you don't put it this way, if India is opposed to China in the American camp, a war against China is a two-front war. That's a war that's hard for China to win. If you make it a one-front war, you're making life a lot easier for the Chinese, and why Biden would be that stupid. At some point, you have to stop believing idiocy, and you have to say, is there something wrong with this corruption? Now, I know the people in the Beltway are stupid, but I wonder if they're legitimately this stupid. But hey, maybe they are.
Okay,
I don't
but
know.
here's the thing: with the current administration, all right, we know it's an extension. Technically, it's Obama's third term. Really, I mean, that's what it is. Just Trump was
Agreed.
a bit of a dead cat bounce, as I like to say. We see what Obama did geopolitically, the Arab Spring. We see what happened with Gaddafi, right? We see what they did to Algeria, Egypt, which gets brushed under the rug. And of course,
And which is stabilizing nicely under Sisi. So the Muslim Brotherhood is under control there, and that country seems to have their act together.
It's funny you say that, because the first person to call Donald Trump on the night of the election to congratulate him was Sisi. We also signed a lot of, we have a big arms deal with Egypt too. Let's not forget that also. But here's the thing. We also see what's going on with Yemen, which has been this low grade proxy war. And you can stretch that as far back as like the 1950s. I mean, I got an amazing book about Yemen during the Yemeni civil war of the 1960s, where I don't know if you know about this, but Sykes, digressing for just one moment, because you would appreciate this random little factoid. A stamp collector from California was sending postcards to the Sultan's son of the royal Yemeni family in the early 1960s, and they became pen pals, exchanging stamps back and forth. When the civil war in Yemen broke out, the Sultan's son, who wound up being, I think, the president of one half of Yemen after the civil war, said, "Why don't you come here and fight with me?" And he became like a glorified, glorified royalty and a general of the Royal Yemenis Army during the 1960s, where we were engaging in this proxy war with the Soviet Union. Eventually, the royal family collapsed, which kind of coincides with a lot of things that you talk about, where there's no more families, there's no more, aristocrats, so to speak, where kings, queens, things like that don't exist anymore. But I just thought it was really interesting, a story where
that is pretty interesting.
The
funny thing is, we did a whole show on geopolitics, and interestingly, we didn't even talk once about the Middle East. I mean, we should, before we close up things, at least mention, for the purposes of our people listening, Turkey's neo-Ottoman ambitions, how they were succeeding, and now what it means that the Turkish lira is collapsing. Turkey is going to be a destabilizing country in that regime. Turkey's been getting friendlier with Russia, friendlier with Iran, a lot of issues with Greece, and they've been fighting over those control of what's in the Eastern Med. Basically, the French, the Greeks, the Israelis, and the Egyptians are one faction. And if you want to look at the other way, the Turks, the Libyans who are there, and yeah, to some extent, actually, that's true. The Germans are sort of a different faction, and it's kind of messy. And you got to keep an eye on that area, because we are now in even like that little separatist republic in Serbia.
What about what's going on in Armenia too?
Yeah, there are so many flashpoints. Like you and I could just sit here for an hour and go through them all. But the problem is, like, if someone miscalculates now, we could see a much bigger fight happen because all these pieces are in play. And I mean, the reason why World War One happened, people don't know this, was the military doctrine of that time was that whoever had the most morale and whoever mobilized first won. And so everyone was rushing so that they wanted to make sure they were the first one to the battlefield. And because of that, once people started mobilizing, you literally couldn't risk letting a country mobilize before you did, or you would lose. Then in the age of hypersonic missiles and first strike doctrines, we're back in that sort of scenario. So you might see things push forward very quickly, and that miscalculations by people who don't trust each other will lead to a much bigger fight. And that's the real risk, because I tell you the one thing I am sure of from watching Putin, and I don't blame him, the Russians don't trust the Americans at all. And it's one thing, there are lies you're allowed to tell. Every diplomat, politician is a liar to some extent. But if you don't keep treaties on a regular basis and you break things all the time, don't be surprised when people start calling you on it. And that's when you get sneak attacks and surprise attacks, because they're like, well, they're abominable scum anyway. I mean, anyone who's ever played Civilization understands that. So we're kind of in a spot where the world sees us this way with good cause, because we go, oh, democracy, freedom, rights. And yet people will say, like the Chinese did, actually, they excoriated us like a week ago, saying, okay, you talk about democracy and human rights in America, but you go in and pick wars with whomever you want for whatever reason, whenever you want. And what are you doing? And they're right. I mean, we're hypocrites. And mind you, all these countries are kind of hypocrites. If we ever got back to realpolitik and we had realists like we did during the Cold War running the thing, it might be a more cynical world, but it would actually be a much safer one, I think, too.
But all right, and this is where I want to wrap it up with you. The current administration, again, third term Obama, it's I don't know if you really want to call them neocons, but it's more neoliberal doctrine. They don't really have a good track record. They really don't. I think Ukraine is a victory for them on who they've installed over there, but it seems that they're thirsty, and they seem to want to have their paw hit by someone else. And I think Russia might be that country to do so, to really just push back on this, because look, Syria was 600,000 people dead in Syria. I mean, that was my red pill. I mean, I take the war in Syria very serious. I mean, I watched that.
Remember this too. We were supposed to go to war in Syria. Remember Obama's red line?
Yeah.
I mean, it's the same reason why Bush ended up getting into Iraq. He had to finish his daddy's things. But Biden has to finish Daddy Obama's things, and he gets caught up in these problems.
Yeah, but it's just that Iraq, obviously, there was like 3 million dead in Iraq, 2.5, 3 million on the high if you look at the Lancet report. But you see that you don't hear anything about Syria anymore. You hear nothing about it. If you really think about it, look what Trump did. Trump really defanged the United States in the global politics in a lot of sense. You don't hear anything about ISIS anymore. You don't really hear that much about terrorists or Muslims anymore.
Well, ISIS was largely defeated. The CIA stopped funding them.
Yeah, right.
That's the truth of it. And what was the old joke? That ISIS is USIS, And I think that's the truth of it. I mean, America. One of the things this is actually interesting, though. It's an aside that might be worth remembering. Apparently, I don't remember how many months ago, somewhere between 2 to 6 months ago, there was an article that went out that apparently there were a whole bunch of CIA assets that were all taken down at once. A lot of the human intelligence assets that someone had leaked something, and supposedly as much as 200 operatives were taken into custody or removed from the equation. And so we really might be flying blind at this point. I mean, you've seen those CIA ads where they talk about woke and diversity. I mean, we don't have the A-team. This isn't George Kennan and the Dulles brothers running the show here. We have idiots in charge who literally believe some of their own crap. And we may be in much more risk than we realize, specifically because, frankly, the people we have are inept and they believe their own ideologies.
I call it the Karenocracy.
Well, you know what? Even in some ways, these people might even be worse than Karens, because at least Karens are just following directions. These people actually are coming up with policies to put out there. And I would say that there has been nothing to encourage people the idea that there's any competence in the American administration, save for the people who are in positions of power. The most competent people seem to be those who are figuring out how to make enough graft to make money to make themselves
Right.
wealthy and escape the system.
Yeah, they're looking. They're
you know,
looking out for themselves before the nation.
and I don't even blame them. You know, I say this to people because I have Republicans go to me and they say, you know, Tom, why is it? Give me 1 second here. Why is it that you say why don't you say do the right thing? And I'm like, the thing about it is, if you can take from the system right now and you can realistically make that work for you, do it. And the reason I'm saying that is because it's going to collapse and you're going to need the resources to survive this. We don't know when it's going to collapse, but we ultimately know why it's going to collapse. That we, A, have no cultural cohesion, that's to say we all hate each other, and B, that our money eventually isn't going to be worth crap because there's nothing they can do arrest that of sort of winning a global world war and forcing everyone to use the dollar again. And if they fight that war, it is my prediction the Russians would win it because they would take out our major cities with a first strike thing. And you know what? All of our allies are allies with us because we give something to them, not because they give that much to us. It's the truth.
Do you think?
And it's bad to be a hedge fund.
Part of the downsides of globalization is that these elites treat cities as their archipelago, so they can piss off to Paris. They can fly a private helicopter from Midtown Manhattan to the Hamptons. So they're trying to basically separate themselves from the hoi polloi, and it's with an international flavor to it, where Singapore to Tokyo to Hong Kong, so on and so forth.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, that's what it is. They have colonies. I mean, I'll even give you an example, like in the state of Maine, for instance, where I'm up here, and I live in rural Maine. But you can see how it happens in real time. They put colleges in certain towns and county seats, and then they try to convert places. This is what they do. They come in and they pick areas.
I never thought of that. That's a good point. The amount of colleges. Were there? Let me ask you something. You know more about this than I do. Were there this many colleges 30 years ago?
No, not 30 years ago. I mean, New England specifically always had a bunch, but no, there were a whole bunch of things in it. Really, when colleges got big was when I think it was the Bush administration, although it might have been Clinton, banned the ability to have bankruptcy on student loans. Yeah. I mean, and the reason why was because it was a loan you couldn't lose money. It was a loan the government agreed to guarantee on lenders who couldn't otherwise qualify, but you could get for any reason, and they weren't allowed to file bankruptcy on it. So you knew you had a degree of security. I mean, it's the most cynical gerontocracy, rule of the old over the poor, of the young, that had happened in a long time because people needed the ability to file bankruptcies, but they got rid of that protection for individuals. And as they did that, then a whole bunch of colleges came up because they realized, hey, this is a great opportunity to make money. And, they did. And so that's when it really got a lot bigger. And you saw the growth of community colleges. And I mean, there's a whole cycle that works. My friend John Q does a better job with it.
Aren't those going to collapse at some point? I just can't believe it's still going on. And people are still.
Well, I mean, the thing is, education doesn't inherently have value, but it doesn't have cost either. I mean, you're asking young people who don't understand how money works to take out loans, and that ultimately those just kind of keep it going. I mean, it's sort of fake, but it's fake in the sort of way the system tends to endorse, if that makes any sense. So, in theory, you're right that the scam should collapse, but it's a good corollary to the existing sort of problems that are put forward, and it's a way to promote certain ideas. So long as these places are on board with the larger propaganda agenda, and the idea of getting people into debt is something the system likes to do early, because you get propagandized. At the same time, you get in a position where, because you have debt you can't get rid of, you're going to be much more compliant to the system. Like if you take, to use this example, right? Because you use the example of the New York the blackout, or what happened in 2003. If you had austerity like in the 30s, when still 80 to 90% of the people understood how to farm and had access to land, or at least their family did, where they could go back, it's one thing. But now all you have is people with specialized skills that only work in a highly modern economy, and where they don't have these skill sets, and where they're buried underneath debt to the point where they have no assets, then people aren't going to leave the system because they don't know how to survive without it. They might say the system's terrible and this is corrupt, but what other choice do I have? I can't make it on my own. I mean, literally, as we're sitting here at 11 o'clock at night, I'm not even joking. It's 0 degrees outside of Maine, and I'm trying to keep my lemon tree going here by putting a little bit of water on it. But I don't know if I can keep it warm enough downstairs. But most people aren't willing to live that life, and to really downstream to the extent it takes to be able to kind of even contemplate surviving. This is even like preppers and people who act like they're hard. They're like, oh, well, when this happens, I'm going to go do that. Let me tell you, I've been living the life as close to the ground as anyone from a suburb background really can. It's really hard. And if you think you're not going to do it and you're just going to jump into it one day when you have to, I got bad news for you. The things you never thought were a problem are going to be the ones that catch you. Most people aren't even willing to contemplate that. A lot of people who contemplate it can't do it, or who try it won't succeed. So a lot of people, not crazily, are going to make the decision that whatever ridiculous they come forward with, I'm just going to agree with it because it's the path of least resistance, and I'm stuck making this bad bet because I don't know how to bet on anything else.
Well, it's funny because, we're talking about the college situation, and the only reason why I could think someone would still go to college is it becomes more like a sinking vessel where all the rats run to the, it's either the stern or the bow at the very tip of either of the end. So people are like, oh, you got to go to college now because, everything's going to be short and everything's going to be more scarce. No, that's the wrong way of thinking it. You start thinking more minimalistic. You need to start, realizing that the situation's much more transient and volatile. I mean, I'm really contemplating. Listen,
but young folks don't know this, right? Because the problem of youth is they don't know that things are worse than they used to be. Yeah. And it's a generational decline that every one of us deals with. And we can't, like, for instance, like privacy, living in an age before cell phones, like I will do something where, in fact, this, I will shut my cell phone off and I just won't be available. People are like, well, I couldn't get a hold of you, and they panic. I'm like, I'm paying for this service. If I don't want to be available because I'm spending time with my wife or reading a book or whatever, I don't even need a reason. I'm going to do that because I have the expectation and demand that there's going to be a degree of privacy in my life. But people who've grown up with technology around from moment one, who've seen certain things, their expectations are different. And this is where we've really lost this war, that the managing of expectations of what is normal, we didn't push back. We tried to defend our own sort of autonomy, but we surrendered normalcy. And that's why young people just don't understand.
Yep, you got that right. Feel bad for younger people these days. I'm friends with a 24-year-old, and I told him today, I'm like, thank God I'm not your age. He's like, oh, gee, thanks. I mean, we remember an age before there was smartphones. I mean, not for nothing, I didn't get a smartphone until 2015. I was a holdout because I realized that what it will do is make me stupider in a lot of ways. My attention span's definitely shorter since owning this thing. I'm constantly looking at it. It's not healthy, and yet we see our elites are promoting it. France is pushing back. France has banned cell phones in high schools. So you see you see some type of pushback against this technology. And, the internet was a nice thing, and social media doesn't have to be what it is, but they've kind of exasperated some of the worst qualities in humans' instincts, such as narcissism, self-absorption, hedonistic abandonment.
I kind of have the belief that any technology that can be used for a bad cause will eventually be. And it's just because it's my view of human nature that we tend towards sin, which is to say we tend to do towards that which is to our own benefit without consequence of what the larger things are. And I think you're right. And I think that one of the conversations we need to desperately begin having for our survival of our species is a more fundamental understanding of what humanity's relationship to technology is. And I would suggest that the idea of autonomous technologies that can operate and influence things absent human control, management, or augmentation is something that's a line we should be very loath to cross, and yet people are galloping across it. And I think that those are the battles that are going to define the future. And I think they're going to be here far sooner and far more painfully than almost anyone is ready for. I think they're already here, to be honest, but I think it's just we're seeing the leading indicators.
I'm going to end it off on this note. One question. How come the baby boomers are so afraid of dying?
Well, they had... One of the interesting things about that generation is they did have a cult of youth. and they have tried very long and hard to think, oh, I'm with it, to the point of complying, to the point of stupidity. I mean, I think they were the first relationship that really started living in the godless world. And I think fear of death is something that's really terrible for them. And I don't want to make light of it. I think I think a lot of them really tried to do things on their own virtue. And now having seen, I think a lot of them either in delusions of how it didn't work, or this idea that, they've done all they can and there's nothing left. I think that there is a terror, and that they're just hanging on because they don't think there's anything else. Behind all that faux idealism, there's a nihilism at the heart of all they're doing. And I would argue, in fact, I do argue, that nihilism has been a poison in the West, not just since the boomer generation, but it was actually one of the battles that presaged what happened with the finance. And, it started with taking the church out of schools and taking religion out of it. I mean, if you have a godless society, you basically have a society that doesn't have a moral compass.
Wait, hold on. So most countries do have religion in their part of their government, do they not?
Well, I don't want to say most countries. I would say that historically, people there's been a larger role for the faith in whether it be Christianity or Islam or whatever it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Hey, listen, I won't keep you any longer. I appreciate you having this conversation with me, and well, my door just opened. It's getting windy out there. Listen, I know you got to go tend to your lemons. Thanks for doing this chat with me. It's been an absolute pleasure, and we should definitely get
Sure. Let me just say Merry Christmas and the Lord's blessing upon everyone there. If you like my work, go check it out on Amazon. I'll be on plenty more. And check out the Telegram group, t.me/Atlantic Homeland. Lots of reprobates like your host here hang out with
I'm on
me.
there. It's a fun group to chat with.
It is, and it manages to be a little scary without being too scary. We definitely do that. Thank you for having me on, and let me just, like I said, Merry Christmas to everyone, and it is always my pleasure and honor to spend a little time with you.
Hey, listen, tell your lovely better half Merry Christmas, and I'll talk to you tomorrow. I wish you Merry Christmas. All right, man?
All right, sounds good. God bless.
Take care. You too. God bless.